Hello and welcome to the screencast. This is Hendershott-Kraetzer in the Department of Humanities at Olivet College, and today we're going to be talking about one of the foundational features of poetry, one of the most important formal aspects, images and imagery. This overview is designed for creative writing students, but anyone in literature classes should find it useful, and I think it will be helpful as well for people who are preparing to take standardized tests, because it's a review of foundational concepts that may well show up in an exam like that. There are three parts to this presentation, part one, part two, and part three. Part one is going to take us through some basics of images and imagery. Part two will look at how images can be used and the difference between literal and figurative images. And part three will go into more detail about figures of speech and figurative imagery. I hope you enjoy this. I hope you find it useful. So let's get going. We're going to be going over a whole series of things today. In order, our major topics of conversation are the idea of images and imagery, what they are, using images, the idea of what kinds of images you can use, literal and figurative, some examples of the different figures of speech as expressed in poetry writing, and then we will wrap up with a summary and we'll be out of here. So what you're looking at right now is an image. It's a visual, obviously. This is the volcano in the middle of the island of St. Kitts in the Caribbean. It's a beautiful place. It's obviously a beautiful place. But one of the difficult things about poetry writing is communicating the sense of beauty, of stillness, of peace, or of excitement, or whatever emotion you might be feeling at a place like this. Could be terror because you're scared of mountains, or of being out in nature. It's unclear exactly what the speaker might be feeling, or the viewer might have been feeling by looking at this, despite however pretty it might actually be. And that's what an image tries to do in a poem. So, what is an image? How would a writer describe something like this scene in a piece of writing, lacking the power of a visual? Images are word pictures. They use sensory detail to evoke a physical sensation and often associated memories. And for me, actually, the idea of the associated memories is the most important part of an image. An image can be powerfully descriptive, but it's what it evokes that goes along with it. A writer never has absolute control over that, but you have a lot of tools at your disposal in getting your readers to the memories you want them to either understand or to evoke in them a similar emotional or even physical response. More poetically put, an image is the rendering of your bodily experience in the world. It's how you take your experiences and put them out there in the world to bring people into your world, to bring your readers to where you were, to help them see the world through the lens of your consciousness. And finally, a way of thinking about images is they are engines of poems. If you don't have good imagery, you're probably not going to have a very good poem. So it sounds like they're really important, which in fact they are, and that's why this is the first of the talks on poetry, is because of the centrality of images to effective, powerful poetry. There are 5 different senses, basically, that you can talk about. The first one is sight. The second is sound or hearing. The third is touch. The fourth is scent. I know this is obviously a visual thing, but what I'd like you to do as you're looking at this is think of the smell of a fresh peach. A fresh peach right at the height of summer, just come off the tree. And taste. I love Brussels sprouts, so B would be the one for me. My wife is kind of lukewarm about Brussels sprouts, so she's probably in the land of C, because bacon makes everything better. Most people looking at this would be, God, Brussels sprouts, I don't ever want to eat anything like that, so they would be A. But basically, you put a Brussels sprout in front of somebody, and they're going to have an immediate taste response. Images are based on those 5 senses. They can use them in combination or singly, or they can do cross linkages using something visual to describe a taste, and so on and so on. And once you start using an image, then you are using imagery. The use of images in a poem or any piece of artwork really is imagery. So you had, for example, imagery in that first visual you saw, fireflies, or imagery of peaches. Imagery is also often used to describe a coherent pattern of images in an artwork. So a poem might have a series of images, and so you could talk about the poet's imagery, or you could talk about a pattern of imagery if they are all linked together. And we'll see some examples of that as we're working our way through the slides. And finally, Adonisio and Lau, who you saw quoted a little bit ago, describe imagery as how poetry will become an experience for the reader rather than simply talk about an experience. So the imagery, again, brings people into the world of the writer rather than merely describing a series of things that are seen or smelled or touched or tasted. So here's an example of an image of something visual. This is the Great Sphinx at Giza in Egypt. I'm going to give you a second to look at that and think about the ways in which you might describe that Sphinx. It's huge, obviously. It's made out of stone. It's old. It's weathered. It's got lots of shades of brown and beige, and you can see the bricks in that actually make up the feet, so you can get an idea of the immense scale of that thing. So you're looking at the Sphinx. How might a poet actually describe it? Here's an example from William Butler Yeats's The Second Coming. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. Now that might not be how you would decide to describe the Sphinx, which is perfectly okay. But what Yeats is trying to do is bring you into his world of the Sphinx, and particularly his vision of the impending apocalypse. The poem was written in the early part of the 20th century, and Yeats saw the world as coming apart at the seams. So the Second Coming is the story of the impending apocalypse that he saw heralded in his private symbology by the idea of a sphinx stalking across the desert. And you get the idea of an immense sphinx like the one you saw in that picture. What he's doing is he's choosing very, very specific details in which to use to describe the sphinx. They might not be the ones you use, but again, they bring you into a sense of the monstrousness of this beast. A gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. So I, anyway, get an idea of this gigantic stone monster striding across the desert with vultures circling around it, their shadows kind of flitting over the giant tawny hide, and so on and so on. Here's another example from The Girl Who Loved the Sky. This is the first part of the poem. Outside the second grade room, the jacaranda tree blossomed. And I stopped it right there. You can tell by the ellipses there's more that's coming there, because when I read this the first time, I had no visual point of reference for a jacaranda tree. Maybe I've seen one, maybe I haven't, but it didn't call anything to mind for me. So what I'm going to do is, now that I've shown this to you, I'm going to show you an actual tree so you can get an idea of what the blossoms look like. And then I'm going to give you the rest of the first part of the poem. Outside the second grade room, the jacaranda tree blossomed into purple lanterns. The papery petals drifted, darkening the windows. Inside, the room smelled like glue. The desks were made of yellowed wood, the tops littered with eraser rubbings, rulers, and big fat pencils. Colored chalk meant special days. The image that you get at the beginning of the blossoming tree may not mean anything to the reader if they don't have any actual point of reference for that thing. So the poet gives you here an image of purple lanterns, and if you think about that actual picture of the tree, it really, really works. And the thing of it is when you read the whole poem, when you read the image of the tree in context, purple lanterns and papery petals drifted gives you actually a really good idea of what the tree looks like, of what the blossoms look like, the texture of the petals. So the writer uses both visuals, both sight and texture, a touch, to give you an idea of what the blossoms of the tree are like. And then there are other images through the rest of this particular section. You've got scent, which smelled like glue. You have touch and sight again with yellowed wood, tops littered with eraser rubbings, rulers, and big fat pencils. And I think you probably even get a little bit of scent with eraser rubbings, because if you've ever used an eraser, and if you think back to when you were a kid, erasers have a very specific smell. If you don't believe me, go pick up a pencil and give an eraser a sniff, and you're like, oh yeah, that's what that smell is. Tons of images in this poem. Most of them very, very simple. You notice that there's nothing in this other than the tree that a reader would have any trouble accessing through their kind of library of scents and smells and sights. Imagery and images do not have to be super complex or super difficult. And that takes us through the end of our first presentation. So what have we looked at? We've looked at an overview of imagery, giving you an idea of the different ways in which it can work, how it appeals and works with the five senses. Now we're going to move on to how images can be used and introduce the concept of literal images versus figurative images.